Deputy Prime Minister, the growth projections are completely different from those that you came into power facing. The story is completely different. The black hole, reportedly in the FT today, 12 billion. Doesn't that mean that there has to be a reconfiguring of this whole thing?
I think you're right, of course, that circumstances have significantly deteriorated, notably but not exclusively because of what's happened in the Eurozone, which affects us directly. It's our economic hinterland. Also the uncertainties in America over their political gridlock and so on. Do we need to react? Yes, we need to react. I don't think the right thing to do is therefore to rip up the rule book on balancing the books, because that's the kind of platform upon which you then do other things. But we do need to do more, and we are doing more. If you look at some of the things that we've been talking about in this very conference, about a new fund for infrastructure investment in local areas, the speech I made last week about making sure that the
but even talking about infrastructure, local authority capital spending has been cut by 58%. There's nothing there for infrastructure.
Well, you've got to remember about infrastructure is that it's a combination of public money and private money. In fact, the bulk of money that goes into phone lines and roads and rails actually comes from the private sector. The question is, how are you smart about using our money as taxpayers to make sure that a lot of other money comes into the kind of things which create jobs today but also help the country in the future? Superfast broadband, road improvements, rail improvements, green energy. And that's why, take the Green Investment Bank, for example, very much an idea which we generated as Liberal Democrats in opposition, being delivered by Vince Cable and Chris Huhne. It uses a pot of public money, £3 billion, which we put forward, and we think that will then actually create a pot of about £18 billion to invest in green infrastructure. We're going to be making some announcements in the weeks ahead about housing, because clearly I think it helps people's confidence when they see new homes being built in their community. And of course, it's an essential way of giving young people who don't have a foot on the property ladder a chance of dreaming of actually owning their own property. Well, these are all things I think where we do need to step up the pace, and we are stepping up the pace. There's a real gear change going on in Whitehall now to make sure where we've got infrastructure money, it's getting out of the door as quickly as possible.
It's very clear that Vince Cable certainly sees one of the current problems as a very severe disconnect between the burden that the poor are paying, and even middle income are paying, and what high-earning executives of banks, businesses and the rest of it. And the fact of the matter is you've been in power for 15 months and this has not changed. It's actually got worse.
Well, I think what I believe strongly, and Vince does, and we all do as Liberal Democrats, is look, there's nothing wrong with rewarding people for success. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's when people are rewarded for failure that things go wrong. We've seen it now.
But you've been rewarding people for failure. Take those executives at RBS. You told us that all the executive earnings will be published. We don't even know who the new millionaires in RBS, a loss-making bank last year, are. Look, there is no transparency at all.
I totally accept. I would have dearly liked to go further on top pay and bonuses in some of the state-owned banks. There are, I don't think we've got time for it now, some fairly ferocious complexities because of the contracts they've signed under the previous government and so on and so forth. But I think we're doing more, actually, in a year and a half than Labour, would you believe it, did in 13 years, in being very, very clear that we will not tolerate an economic culture where people can be paid extravagant salaries and, more than that, huge sky-high bonuses for ruining businesses.
Well, will you tolerate?
And I think it's a very important point. This is not an anti-business point. Actually, most sensible business people I speak to accept that shareholders, for instance, owners of a company, have every right to know how much people are being paid and have every right to insist that someone gets rewarded for success but doesn't get lavish payoffs for messing things up.
But will you tolerate, for example, a situation in which a UBS, the rogue trader, mimics exactly what happened in the French bank only 2 years ago? Nothing has changed. Well, now, Vince Cable said... let me just finish the question. Vince Cable said this morning, we will enact the Vickers legislation within this Parliament. That means you are pledging to go to the polls next time round with banks subject to totally new controls. That wasn't in the original response to Vickers. We were talking about 2020. So are you saying 2015, 2016?
With the greatest respect, I think you're mixing things up. Vickers himself, the independent commission, said these changes, which are very, very radical, you and I no doubt would share the view, can't we all do it by next Tuesday? I'm afraid you just can't. These are actually very, very complex things where you're basically building walls, building ring fences in very, very complex, entangled businesses.
9 years?
Well, listen, you are not with the greatest respect, you're a great interviewer, but you're not a banking expert. The experts have told...
No, I'm expert enough to see that it's happened once, now it's happened twice. How many more times before there is a move?
Let me finish. At some point, you either accept in government and in public policy that when people who really know what they're talking about, who've been given the complete freedom to look at it independently, recommend something, it's slightly foolish if you then start second guessing it. They said they think 2019 is the backstop date by which these reforms should be implemented. My own view is that actually what we will see is that they will be implemented much earlier than that, but that's the backstop date.
History tells us the slip sliding and in actual fact it won't happen.
You're not letting me finish. Where I think people had legitimate concerns, and I listened to this very closely, was, but is the government really going to legislate in primary legislation on the floor of the House of Commons to make sure that no one can wriggle out of this? And we could not have been more unambiguous. We could not have been clearer. This is the most radical blueprint for banking reform anywhere in the developed world. It never happened under Labour. It's been produced in 18 months by this new government, and we've said very clearly we're going to act on it and act on it within this Parliament.
Well, now, one of the things people look to you to do is to make absolutely certain that the privatisation instincts that exist in certain parts of the body politic will not privatise the NHS. But the fact is that the bill that you voted for in the House of Commons contains glaring possibilities, for example, of American or German companies coming in and running slabs of the NHS, and conflicts of interest in which doctors are allowed to own shares in companies with which they will then place practice demands.
Well, firstly, can I just say, if you actually look at what happened, right? What happened over the last several years under Labour, I think people still don't quite get what an outrage it was that Labour was giving preferential sweetheart deals to private companies. About £250 million of your money and mine, of taxpayers' money, was wasted on preferential private contracts signed between Labour and private contractors to deliberately undermine the NHS. I know this from my own work.
That was Labour. Now you're dealing with the Tories.
No, hang on. And what we have done, this is the thing, what we've done in the legislation, given that in the past you had backdoor privatisation deliberately designed by Labour to undermine the NHS, we've said this will be illegal, not just discouraged, illegal. And what we've said instead...
You say that, but the fact is
no,
that Shirley Williams and other members of the Liberal Democrat benches in the House of Lords don't believe it.
No, that's not true. What I've actually...
You've got Shirley Williams behind you now, have you?
On that point, absolutely.
But not generally. She's still going to battle against this bill.
Let me try and answer. What Shirley Williams still has some residual concerns about is the accountability, the political accountability of the whole system. So it is wrong to suggest that on the issue of privatisation there is any anxiety amongst Liberal Democrat ranks. We've been very clear. No privatisation, no Labour government-style backdoor privatisation, a complete level playing field where what matters above and beyond everything else is the interests of the patient and protecting the virtues of the NHS, the principles of the NHS, that it is free at the point of use, based on need, not on the ability to pay.
You will still see your peers voting against this bill.
I don't think that is true at all. The residual concerns relate to something which is very technical, which is whether the legislation is clear or not enough about the relationship between the Secretary of State and the bodies, the arm's length bodies in the NHS. And I can get into the detail if you like, but we've been very clear that where there is doubt and where we think reasonably we can further amend legislation, we will do that in the House of Lords to make it utterly clear that the Secretary of State will remain accountable for a comprehensive health service in the future.
Few politicians have been through the baptism of fire that you've been through in the last 18 months.
That's what you call it.
Virtually Dracula. And it would therefore not be surprising if you had to say to your wife, listen, I fully accept. I can hardly get the kids to school. The fact is I will only do one term, and that's that. Now it seems that smoother waters have dawned. Have you had a conversation which says, I'll do 2 terms?
Joe, there are so many things I'm very happy to answer questions about. What Miriam and I say to each other, is, much as I think what you said to your members of your family, is entirely private. That's the first point. That's the first point. But without trying to relay to the nation conversations that Miriam and I have with each other, what I can confirm to you is that I'm in for this for the long run. I really believe in what we're doing. I accept that this has caused a lot of short-term controversy and unpopularity. But how I measure success...
But very briefly, if asked, you would serve second time.
Of course, I want to see this through the next general election and beyond. Okay. I'm 44 years old. I've got bags of energy. I believe there's a big project to try and repair the damage done to our economy and create the reforms which will make a better, fairer Britain in the long term.
Last question. How good a Tory is David Cameron?
I think he's an impeccable Conservative. He's the leader of the Conservative Party.
Is he what you recognise as a Tory completely?
Of course he is. He's the leader of the Conservative Party. It would be very peculiar
and
if he was not.
You are still dining with the enemy in a sense.
Well, we're opponents. Of course, we're political opponents. We compete for votes at election time. We have a different outlook on life. We have different ideological underpinnings. But it doesn't mean...
But you rather like him?
Well, it doesn't mean at a time of crisis, when the economy is in real peril, it is wrong for us to say, hang on a minute, let's for once do in politics, which actually many people do every day of their lives, set aside our differences for the long-term benefit of the country. I think that is a perfectly good, reasonable, sound instinct.
Nick Clegg, thank you very much for talking to us.